35 years ago, 5 firefighters from Station 19 vanished during what should have been a routine emergency call. Captain Thomas Mitchell, Lieutenant David Sullivan, and firefighters Robert Chen, Michael Torres, and James Washington disappeared without a trace on the night of October 14, 1972, plunging their families into unimaginable grief and the entire community into shock and confusion. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps us bring you more stories like this one. The emergency call came in at 11:47 p.m. Reports of smoke and possible structural damage in the old subway maintenance tunnels beneath downtown. Captain Thomas Mitchell, a 22-year veteran, led his crew into what witnesses described as an unusual glow coming from underground access points. Radio contact was maintained for 23 minutes as they descended into the labyrinthine tunnel system that few people truly understood. Mitchell's last transmission, recorded by dispatch, was chilling in its simplicity. "We've found something down here, requesting backup units," and the radio went silent at 12:10 a.m. The police investigated every possibility: equipment failure, tunnel collapse. Even kidnapping theories were explored as search teams combed every accessible passage for weeks. Detective Raymond Harper led an investigation that mobilized every available resource, but the 5 firefighters seemed to have vanished into the earth itself. The families refused to accept the official conclusion of presumed dead due to structural accident. Margaret Mitchell, the captain's wife, spent her life savings hiring private investigators. She organized candlelight vigils that drew hundreds of community members, all demanding answers that never came. Linda Chen, 7 months pregnant when her husband Robert disappeared, raised their daughter Amy with stories of a father she would never know. The Torres and Washington families, along with David Sullivan's elderly Irish immigrant parents, formed an unbreakable bond of shared grief and determination. They met every anniversary, sharing theories and supporting each other through decades of official indifference and public forgetfulness. Years passed, and the case grew cold. The 5 families watched their loved ones fade from public memory, their story buried beneath newer tragedies. But they never stopped fighting for the truth, never stopped believing that somewhere in those dark tunnels lay the answers to what happened that October night. The official investigation was quietly closed in 1975, leaving behind only questions, grief, and a community that would never be the same. The disappearance didn't just claim 5 lives, it shattered 5 families and left an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about safety and protection. Each family faced their own unique struggle with grief that had no resolution, no closure, no end. Margaret Mitchell found herself raising 3 children alone while fighting a battle that consumed her every waking moment. Sarah, 16 when her father vanished, watched her academic performance crumble as she struggled with anxiety about people she loved disappearing without explanation. Thomas Jr., 14, became obsessed with the fire department and tunnel systems, memorizing every detail about underground infrastructure. Michael, only 11, refused to accept his father was gone, setting a place for him at dinner every night. Margaret worked double shifts as a nurse to support the family, while conducting her own investigation with the methodical intensity of a professional detective. Her dining room became a command center, covered with maps, photographs, witness statements, and correspondence with anyone who might have information. She attended every city council meeting where public safety was discussed, always asking the same questions that officials answered with polite dismissals. David Sullivan's parents, Patrick and Catherine, were Irish immigrants whose American dream centered around their son's service to the community. Catherine kept David's room exactly as he left it, his firefighter's helmet hanging on the bedpost. She set 5 places at Sunday dinner for years, telling neighbors the boys would be hungry when they came home. Patrick aged decades in months following his son's disappearance, his black hair turning completely grey, as he struggled with bureaucracy made more difficult by limited English skills. Linda Chen faced isolation compounded by cultural barriers. As one of the few Asian American families in their neighborhood, she worked multiple jobs while devoting every spare moment to searching for her husband. Amy grew up with photographs covering every surface of their apartment, living under the weight of being her father's memorial, while excelling academically to make him proud. Michael Torres's parents, Elena and Carlos, spoke little English, making their navigation of the investigation even more challenging. They relied on community translators and church support, holding prayer vigils that blended Catholic traditions with cultural practices from Mexico. Elena blamed herself for not discouraging Michael's dangerous career choice, while Carlos couldn't understand how someone could vanish in a modern American city. The Washington family had overcome significant challenges to build middle-class stability. James's parents, Robert and Dorothy, were part of the Great Migration from the segregated South, working multiple jobs to ensure their children had opportunities they never enjoyed. James's disappearance felt like a cruel reversal of their progress. His younger brother Marcus, 15 at the time, became obsessed with the fire department and investigation, spending hours at the station hoping to overhear information about search efforts. The five families became advocates for changes in search procedures, better communication with families, and more thorough missing persons investigations. They learned to navigate bureaucracies and maintain hope in the face of official indifference. But beneath their activism lay deeper wounds, the daily reality of living with uncertainty, never knowing whether their loved ones were dead or suffering somewhere beyond reach. Their persistence gradually convinced neighbors and supporters that the investigation had been inadequate from the beginning. The missing firefighters became symbols not just of individual tragedy, but of systemic failures that affected everyone's safety. As years passed, the families developed routines around their search, meeting every anniversary and maintaining constant pressure on officials. The community watched these families carry their burden year after year, and many began to wonder if the truth was something the authorities preferred to keep buried. The dedication of the families, their refusal to accept easy answers, planted seeds of suspicion that would eventually grow into demands for accountability that couldn't be ignored. The tunnel system beneath the city was far more than simple passages. It was a subterranean maze that had evolved over decades of construction, abandonment, and modification. Built initially in the early 1900s as part of an ambitious subway project, later abandoned due to funding shortfalls, these underground arteries had become forgotten infrastructure that few people understood. Over decades, various city departments used portions for different purposes. Utilities companies installed water mains and electrical cables. During Prohibition, rumors persisted that bootleggers used tunnels for illegal alcohol transport. World War II saw some sections designated as air raid shelters. By 1972, the system had become a bureaucratic orphan, appearing on some maps but not others, with responsibility scattered across departments that rarely communicated effectively. City engineers described the tunnels as complex but manageable, but veteran firefighter Danny Kowalski, who worked alongside the missing men, painted a different picture. "Sound carries in ways that make no sense," he explained. "You can hear conversations from passages hundreds of yards away, but can't hear someone shouting from the next room. The air circulation changes with weather conditions above ground, and there are sections where temperature varies 20 degrees between adjoining areas." Emergency crews had gotten lost in passages they'd navigated successfully before. Radio communication was unreliable, with dead zones that appeared and disappeared without pattern. Most disturbing, crew members reported feeling disoriented in areas that seemed designed to confuse rather than facilitate navigation. The official search efforts were hampered by these complications from day one. Teams with state-of-the-art communication equipment found themselves unable to contact command posts just hundreds of yards away. Maps showing clear connections led searchers to dead ends or walls that shouldn't have existed. Teams entering together frequently became separated, spending hours trying to find each other in a supposedly understood system. Detective Harper became increasingly frustrated with contradictions he encountered. "Every expert gave us different information," his case files noted. Fire department maps showed passages utilities said were sealed years ago. City engineering had blueprints for tunnels construction claimed were never built. It was like investigating a crime scene that kept changing. After 2 weeks, the operation was scaled back due to structural instability, but this masked deeper concerns about search competence itself. The families refused to accept these limitations, hiring spelunkers and urban explorers with money from college funds to venture into areas marked inaccessible. Marcus Webb, a cave rescue specialist, spent 3 days exploring deeper sections at Margaret's request. His report described a 3-dimensional maze with multiple levels, hidden passages, and areas that appear deliberately obscured. He found evidence of recent human activity in sections officials claimed were abandoned for decades. Fresh tool marks, recent concrete patches, and newer construction not shown on any maps. Other independent searchers reported similar inconsistencies. One urban explorer claimed finding firefighter equipment in thoroughly searched areas, but could never relocate the site when leading investigators back. It was like the tunnels had rearranged themselves, he told a reporter, like they didn't want to give up their secrets. The city's response was swift and decisive. Access restrictions requiring special permits, rarely granted, and tied up in bureaucratic procedures. Officials justified restrictions as safety measures, but critics argued the city prioritized controlling information over protecting public safety. These regulations effectively ended independent search efforts families had been funding. As years passed, tunnels became urban legend. Some claimed they were haunted by missing firefighters' spirits, with reports of unexplained sounds and lights from access points. Others whispered the city knew exactly what happened and was covering up to protect powerful interests. Urban explorers developed underground networks to map the system despite restrictions, gradually assembling more complete pictures than any official agency possessed. Their findings consistently suggested the tunnel system was more extensive, complex, and recently modified than any government assessment acknowledged. But beneath speculation and conspiracy theories lay simple truth that would eventually surface. Somewhere in that maze, 5 good men had encountered something powerful. People were determined to keep secret, and answers to their fate remained buried in darkness, maintained as much by human design as absence of light. The 1980s brought cruel normalcy as media attention faded, search teams disbanded, and case files transferred to cold case divisions. For the families, every day remained a reminder of unanswered questions and official indifference that had replaced initial urgency. Margaret Mitchell, now in her late 40s, had spent a decade learning to navigate bureaucracies while maintaining detailed records that surpassed many professional investigations. Her children grew up shaped by their father's disappearance in profound ways. Sarah struggled with anxiety and attachment issues, expecting loved ones to vanish. Thomas Jr. became obsessed with engineering and tunnel systems, developing expertise that made him one of the city's most knowledgeable people about underground infrastructure. Michael, the youngest, battled behavioral problems and unresolved trauma that affected his entire adolescence. Margaret's investigation had become her life's work. Her files expanded to fill several rooms, containing thousands of documents, representing the most comprehensive private investigation of any missing persons case in city history. She had become expert in police procedures, forensic science, urban planning, and city politics through pure determination. Robert Chen's daughter Amy grew up with mythical understanding of her father, built from stories and photographs covering their apartment. Linda worked multiple jobs while devoting spare time to the search, facing isolation, compounded by cultural barriers that made connecting with other families and navigating investigation procedures difficult. The Sullivan family faced devastating losses as Catherine died in 1985 without knowing her son's fate, followed by Patrick 2 years later, his health broken by grief. The Torres family dealt with language barriers and immigrant status that complicated their involvement, while Eleanor's health deteriorated from stress she attributed to not preventing Michael's dangerous career choice. James Washington's family struggled with shattered dreams, as Robert and Dorothy had worked multiple jobs to build stability that felt reversed by their son's disappearance. Marcus joined the fire department himself, hoping to honor his brother's memory, while developing expertise that might help solve the mystery. The families developed routines around shared loss, meeting every October 14th and maintaining communication throughout the year. Margaret emerged as unofficial coordinator, compiling everyone's research and organizing group responses to developments. Their persistence had subtle effects on the broader community, influencing fire department procedure revisions and prompting occasional city council questions about cold cases. But beneath public activism lay deeper struggles with psychological effects of prolonged uncertainty. They learned to function with permanently broken hearts, developing different coping strategies while carrying weight of unanswered questions affecting every aspect of their lives. The community watched these families carry their burden year after year, developing theories about why the case remained unsolved. Some suspected incompetence, others believed in deliberate cover-up. Still others thought the truth was too complex for authorities to handle. Local media occasionally revisited the story, but typically focused on emotional impact rather than investigating procedural or political aspects that might reveal systemic problems. The missing firefighters became part of city folklore, mysterious tragedy referenced in discussions of urban legends and unsolved crimes. But for families, they remained much more than symbols. They were husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers whose absence created voids that could never be filled, and questions that demanded answers, regardless of how long the search might take. The decade of silence was ending, though families didn't realize it. Forces were already in motion that would eventually bring their long ordeal to dramatic and unexpected conclusion, validating their persistence and exposing truths more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined. By the mid-1990s, Margaret Mitchell refused to let memory fade despite her declining health. At 62, she had spent more than half her adult life searching for answers, the toll evident in her grey hair, trembling hands, and hollow eyes that had seen too much disappointment to maintain easy optimism about human nature. Her children had built adult lives around their father's disappearance shadow. Sarah became a social worker specializing in trauma families, struggling with trust issues that made maintaining relationships difficult. Thomas Jr. became an engineering consultant for underground infrastructure, using knowledge acquired through obsessive study of tunnels where his father vanished. Michael had battled addiction and trauma, eventually becoming a counselor while maintaining fragile recovery. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1995, the city announced major infrastructure modernization, requiring the most comprehensive tunnel survey since original construction. Eddie Ramirez, a construction supervisor with underground expertise, was hired to inspect areas that hadn't been examined in decades. What Eddie found in Section 7G, supposed to be sealed since 1973, challenged every assumption about the tunnel system. The area wasn't sealed, but showed evidence of extensive recent activity: fresh tool marks, newer concrete patches, sophisticated ventilation systems not shown on blueprints, and hastily constructed walls creating false dead ends where original blueprints showed clear connections. Eddie's engineering background revealed these modifications required significant resources, specialized equipment, and detailed system knowledge. This was professional construction, by people who understood both physical and political requirements of concealing activities. When he reported findings to supervisors, he was told to focus on structural assessment and ignore inconsistencies. But Eddie had a firefighter brother, and the missing 5 were part of fire department oral tradition. Against orders, he began documenting inconsistencies during breaks, photographing and mapping alterations that revealed coordinated efforts to conceal evidence after 1972. Margaret learned about Eddie's discoveries through fire department contacts. When they met at a downtown cafe, Eddie spread photographs showing concrete work newer than surrounding construction, walls blocking passages shown as open on original blueprints, and construction techniques inconsistent with historical development. "They changed everything down there," Eddie explained urgently. "Whoever did this knew those tunnels inside out and had access to city equipment and materials. This wasn't accident or cave-in. This was deliberate, comprehensive, and expensive." Margaret's hands trembled, examining evidence confirming 20-year suspicions. She shared her files showing city workers assigned to unusual underground projects after the disappearance, concrete deliveries and equipment rentals not corresponding to official projects, and witnesses reporting city vehicles at tunnel access points during unauthorized hours. Amy Chen, now a civil rights attorney specializing in government accountability, joined their alliance. The 3 represented different generations and expertise areas, but shared commitment to exposing truth about the missing firefighters. They began meeting regularly, developing strategies for bringing evidence to public attention that couldn't be ignored by city officials. Amy understood they would face resistance from officials who had spent decades insisting the case was unsolvable, but they finally had proof the truth had been systematically concealed. She began preparing formal complaints, demanding new investigation based on Eddie's evidence, knowing powerful people would do anything to keep secrets buried. The 3 knew they were closer to answers than ever before, but also running out of time. Margaret's cancer diagnosis in early 1997 added urgency to their efforts. She had devoted her life to finding her husband and fellow firefighters, determined to see justice before it was too late. If this case has already grabbed your attention, hit that like button. It helps the channel bring more stories like this one, and helps Thomas Mitchell's story reach more people. Margaret Mitchell's formal complaint in 1996 sent shockwaves through city administration. For the first time in over 20 years, officials faced specific evidence of tunnel system tampering where 5 firefighters had vanished. The response was predictable. City attorneys dismissed photographs as inconclusive and argued any alterations were routine maintenance over decades. But the complaint achieved something unexpected, bringing Eddie's discoveries to other city workers who had noticed similar inconsistencies. Tom Bradley, a retired utilities supervisor, came forward with testimony about being ordered to seal certain passages in months following the disappearance. At the time, he was told it was for safety reasons, but the secrecy had always troubled him. "We worked night shifts with no paperwork, no official work orders, just verbal instructions," Bradley recalled. Supervisors said it was temporary emergency repairs, but you don't seal tunnels permanently for temporary repairs. More workers began coming forward with puzzle pieces scattered across decades of silence. A concrete supplier remembered unusual orders for quick-setting cement delivered to tunnel access points. An electrician recalled disconnecting power to sections without explanation. A security guard reported city vehicles at tunnel entrances during overnight hours when no scheduled work was supposed to occur. The accumulating testimony painted coordinated effort pictures to alter crime scenes, but city officials maintained their position. They argued workers' memories were unreliable after years, and routine maintenance could be misremembered as something sinister. They refused to authorize new searches, citing safety concerns and budget constraints. Margaret's health was declining, but her determination burned brighter than ever. She organized press conferences, contacted investigative journalists, and reached out to other missing persons' families whose cases had been prematurely closed. The story began gaining local media traction, with reporters asking pointed questions about why the city seemed reluctant to pursue new evidence. Amy Chen took different approaches, filing Freedom of Information Act requests for all tunnel system documents from 1970 to 1975. The city's response was heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out for ongoing security concerns and infrastructure protection. The secrecy level only fueled more suspicions about what officials were hiding. Meanwhile, Eddie continued unofficial investigation during regular work assignments. He mapped altered sections and identified at least 6 areas where passages had been permanently sealed after 1972. His engineering background revealed several modifications would have been expensive and time-consuming, requiring specialized equipment and expertise. The families sensed they were closer to truth than ever, but also running out of time. Margaret's cancer diagnosis added urgency to their efforts. She had devoted her life to finding her husband and fellow firefighters, determined to see justice done before it was too late. The city's stubborn resistance to reopening investigation only strengthened their resolve. If officials were this determined to keep tunnels sealed, there had to be reasons. Those reasons, they believed, were buried somewhere in darkness below city streets. Margaret passed away in September 1998, never learning the truth about her husband's fate. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, including firefighters from across the state, who admired her unwavering dedication. In final weeks, Margaret made Amy promise to continue the fight, passing along boxes of documents and lifetime of accumulated evidence. Amy honored Margaret's promise with intensity of someone who had grown up in unsolved mystery shadows. Now in her mid-20s and an established attorney, she had legal skills and resources to pursue the case in ways Margaret never could. She began working with investigative journalists, pro bono lawyers, and forensic experts intrigued by potential cover-up evidence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1999, former city engineer Robert Hartley was dying of lung disease, and his conscience finally overcame fear of retribution. Hartley contacted Amy through an intermediary, agreeing to meet only if she promised to protect his family from legal consequences. What Hartley revealed changed everything. He had been part of the team that altered the tunnel system in late 1972 and early 1973. The work had been authorized at highest government levels and justified as necessary response to structural catastrophe that claimed the firefighters' lives. But Hartley knew the truth was more complicated. There was no catastrophe, Hartley confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. There was an explosion, but it wasn't accidental. Someone had been using those tunnels for illegal activities, storing materials that shouldn't have been there. When the firefighters responded to the call, they walked into a trap. According to Hartley, the 5 firefighters had discovered evidence of smuggling operation involving city officials and organized crime figures. Tunnels were being used to move contraband through the city without detection, and the emergency call that night was intended to lure firefighters into a situation they couldn't survive. The explosion that killed the 5 men was meant to destroy smuggling operation evidence, but it created massive cover-up problems. Rather than risk exposing corruption, city officials decided to seal tunnels permanently and classify the deaths as industrial accident. The altered passages Eddie had discovered weren't just sealing dangerous areas, they were concealing crime scenes. Hartley provided Amy with names, dates, and locations that had never appeared in any official investigation. He had kept detailed personal records of the work, knowing someday the truth would emerge. His testimony implicated several high-ranking city officials who were still alive and holding authority positions. Amy faced a terrible dilemma. She finally had evidence that could solve the missing firefighters' mystery, but pursuing it would expose corruption reaching the city's power structure heart. She thought about Margaret's dedication, about her own father, who died protecting others, about other families who had suffered in silence for decades. The choice was clear. The truth, no matter how dangerous or destructive, was what the 5 men had died trying to uncover. Amy began preparing for the legal battle of her life, knowing powerful people would do anything to keep secrets buried. But she also knew that somewhere in those sealed tunnels lay remains of 5 heroes, and they deserved to come home. The spring of 2007 brought unexpected rain to the city, weeks of steady downpour that tested the aging infrastructure beneath the streets in ways that no one could have anticipated. For 35 years, the modified tunnel system had held its secrets, the concrete barriers and false walls concealing evidence that powerful people had spent decades ensuring would never see the light of day. But nature, it seemed, had other plans. On March 15th at 3:17 a.m., a century-old water main burst beneath 5th Street, sending thousands of gallons of pressurized water cascading through underground passages that hadn't been designed to handle such massive flooding. The force of the water, combined with decades of settling and structural stress, created a chain reaction that would finally expose the truth that Margaret Mitchell had died searching for and that Amy Chen had spent her adult life trying to uncover. By dawn, a massive sinkhole had opened in the middle of the downtown business district, swallowing half a city block and revealing sections of the old tunnel system that hadn't seen daylight since they were deliberately sealed in 1973. City emergency crews, led by Fire Chief Michael Rodriguez, arrived to find a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Twisted metal, broken concrete, and in the depths of the newly exposed cavity, shapes that looked disturbingly like human remains and emergency equipment. Amy Chen received the call at 6:42 a.m. from Eddie Ramirez, whose construction company had been contracted on emergency basis to evaluate the structural damage and determine whether the sinkhole posed additional risks to surrounding buildings. Eddie's voice was barely controlled as he described what the collapsed earth had revealed, a section of tunnel that had been sealed with industrial-grade concrete, and behind that concrete barrier, clearly visible in the morning light, were the unmistakable shapes of firefighting equipment and what appeared to be human skeletal remains. "Amy, they're here," Eddie whispered into his phone, standing at the edge of the sinkhole as emergency vehicles surrounded the area and news crews began to arrive. All 5 of them, exactly where Hartley said they would be. And there's something else down there. Containers, documents, things that prove everything he told you about the smuggling operation was true. Within hours, the sinkhole site had been cordoned off by police tape, and city officials were scrambling to control a narrative that was rapidly spiraling beyond their ability to manage. Mayor Patricia Hendricks, who had been in office for only 2 years and had no connection to the events of 1972, found herself facing the biggest crisis of her political career as news of the discovery spread through local media like wildfire. But the story that Margaret Mitchell had spent her life trying to tell was finally forcing its way into the light, and no amount of official spin or damage control could prevent the truth from emerging. Amy Chen, standing behind the police barriers with tears streaming down her face, knew that this moment represented both the vindication her mother had never lived to see and the beginning of a reckoning that would shake the city's power structure to its foundations. The forensic recovery operation took 3 painstaking days, with teams of archaeologists, forensic anthropologists, and crime scene technicians working around the clock to carefully excavate and document everything the collapsed tunnel had revealed. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the state's chief forensic pathologist, supervised the recovery personally, understanding that this was not just another crime scene, but a piece of history that had been deliberately buried and was now demanding justice. What they found exceeded even Amy's expectations and confirmed Robert Hartley's testimony in ways that were both remarkable and heartbreaking. The remains of Captain Thomas Mitchell, Lieutenant David Sullivan, and firefighters Robert Chen, Michael Torres, and James Washington were discovered exactly where Hartley had said they would be, in a sealed section of tunnel that had been deliberately concealed behind false walls designed to make it appear that the passage had never existed. The firefighters' equipment was still with them after all these years, their helmets, oxygen tanks, flashlights, and radio equipment, all bearing the distinctive markings of Engine Company 19. But more than just confirming their identities, the positioning of the remains and equipment told a story of men who had died fighting, who had tried to radio for help, and who had been trapped in a space that had then been sealed to ensure they would never be found. Along with the remains, investigators discovered evidence that proved Robert Hartley's testimony about the smuggling operation, remnants of wooden containers that had once held contraband, fragments of documentation that included shipping manifests and payment records, and traces of materials that forensic analysis would later identify as components used in manufacturing illegal drugs during the 1970s. But perhaps the most damaging evidence was architectural and engineering analysis that proved beyond any doubt that the explosion that had killed the 5 firefighters had been deliberately set. The blast patterns, preserved in the concrete and metal fragments found at the scene, were consistent with the use of industrial explosives, placed strategically to maximize damage and ensure that no one in the tunnel section could survive. Dr. James Patterson, an explosives expert brought in from the FBI, spent 2 days analyzing the blast evidence and concluded that the explosion had been carefully planned and executed by someone with professional knowledge of demolition techniques. This wasn't an accidental gas leak or equipment malfunction, Patterson explained to investigators. This was a deliberate act of murder carried out with sophisticated knowledge of explosives and their effects in confined spaces. The firefighters hadn't just stumbled upon a smuggling operation. They had been murdered to prevent them from exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of city government. The emergency call that had lured them into the tunnels had been a trap, designed to eliminate 5 men whose integrity and dedication to duty made them threats to people who were using the city's infrastructure for criminal purposes. Amy Chen stood at the edge of the recovery site on the 3rd day, watching as her father's remains were finally brought into sunlight after 35 years in deliberately imposed darkness. She thought about Margaret Mitchell, who had died 9 years earlier, still fighting for this moment, never knowing that her decades of investigation and advocacy would ultimately be vindicated. She thought about all the family members who had passed away without ever learning the truth about their loved one's fate: Catherine and Patrick Sullivan, Elena Torres, Dorothy Washington, and so many others who had carried their grief to their graves. The discovery triggered a massive federal investigation that reached into every level of city government, as prosecutors realized they were dealing not just with a decades-old murder case, but with evidence of systematic corruption and cover-up that had continued for more than 3 decades. FBI agents seized city records going back to the 1970s, interviewed dozens of current and former officials, and began the complex process of building cases against people who had thought themselves safe from consequences after so many years. Several high-ranking officials resigned rather than face federal questioning, while others were arrested on charges ranging from obstruction of justice and conspiracy to accessory to murder. The corruption that had killed 5 firefighters and then hidden their murders for decades was finally being exposed in all its ugly detail, revealing a network of complicity that included police officers, city engineers, construction supervisors, and organized crime figures. For the families who had waited so long for answers, the truth was both vindication and heartbreak. They had been right about the cover-up, write about the inadequacy of the official investigation, write about their loved ones deserving better treatment from the institutions they had served. Margaret Mitchell's theories, dismissed for years as the obsessions of a grieving widow, were proven accurate in every significant detail. But knowing the truth also meant accepting that the men they had mourned as heroes who died in the line of duty had actually been murdered by representatives of the very system they had sworn to protect. The 5 firefighters hadn't died in accidents or natural disasters. They had been killed because they had the misfortune to discover evidence of criminal activity and the integrity to represent a threat to people who valued profit over human life. The city formally apologized to the families and agreed to substantial financial settlements that acknowledged both the loss of the 5 men and the decades of additional suffering caused by the cover-up. Streets were renamed in honor of the firefighters. A memorial park was planned for the site, where they had made their last stand against corruption, and the fire department established annual awards recognizing integrity and dedication to duty. But for Amy Chen and the other surviving family members, no amount of money or official recognition could erase the decades of suffering caused by the deliberate concealment of the truth. Sarah Mitchell, now in her 50s, spoke for many when she said that the financial settlement was less important than the knowledge that her mother's life had not been wasted, that Margaret's refusal to accept easy answers had ultimately led to justice. They had finally brought their heroes home, but the cost had been measured not just in the 5 lives lost in 1972, but in the lifetimes of grief, uncertainty, and betrayal that the families had endured while powerful people worked to ensure the truth would never emerge. The sinkhole that had accidentally exposed their remains was like a wound in the earth itself, forcing the city to confront the moral rot that had been festering beneath its surface for more than 3 decades. The trial of the century began in February 2008, as federal prosecutors brought comprehensive charges against 12 individuals connected to both the original murders of the 5 firefighters and the subsequent cover-up that had concealed the truth for 36 years. The courtroom in the federal building downtown was packed daily with spectators, family members, journalists, and citizens who understood they were witnessing not just a criminal trial, but a reckoning with decades of institutional corruption and betrayal. Among the defendants were former city officials who had authorized the tunnel modifications, construction supervisors who had carried out the physical concealment of evidence, and members of the Castellano organized crime family who had used the tunnel system for smuggling operations throughout the early 1970s. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez, faced the complex challenge of proving crimes that had been committed decades earlier, while demonstrating the ongoing conspiracy that had kept them hidden. The trial opened with testimony from Amy Chen, who took the witness stand for 3 emotional days, presenting the evidence that she and Margaret Mitchell had gathered over decades of relentless investigation. Her voice remained steady as she spoke about growing up without her father, about her mother's unwavering dedication to finding the truth, about the community's loss of faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect and serve them. "My father and the other firefighters didn't just die on October 14, 1972, Amy testified, looking directly at the defendants as she spoke. They were murdered because they represented everything that the people in this courtroom valued least: integrity, honesty, and dedication to public service over personal profit. The cover-up that followed their murders was a continuation of the same crime, stealing decades from families who deserved to know the truth about their loved ones' sacrifice." The prosecution built their case methodically, starting with Robert Hartley's deathbed confession and the detailed records he had maintained of the tunnel modification project. Hartley had died in 2003, but his testimony had been preserved in video depositions taken by Amy's legal team, and his documentary evidence provided a roadmap for understanding exactly how the cover-up had been carried out. Eddie Ramirez testified about his discoveries during the infrastructure modernization project, presenting architectural evidence that proved the tunnel system had been deliberately altered to conceal crime scenes. His engineering expertise allowed him to explain to the jury exactly how much planning, resources, and institutional support would have been required to carry out such extensive modifications without creating official documentation. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the forensic pathologist who had supervised the recovery of the remains, provided detailed testimony about the cause and manner of the firefighters' deaths. Her analysis of the skeletal remains, combined with explosive residue found at the scene, proved that the 5 men had died from blast injuries, consistent with industrial explosives detonated in confined spaces. These men didn't die quickly or easily, Dr. Morgan testified, her clinical language barely masking the horror of what she had discovered. The blast patterns and injury evidence suggest they had time to realize what was happening to them, time to try to call for help, time to understand that they had been betrayed by people they trusted. The prosecution presented evidence of the smuggling operation that had used the tunnels, including testimony from former associates of the Castellano family who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences on unrelated charges. These witnesses described a sophisticated criminal enterprise that moved drugs, weapons, and stolen goods through the city's underground infrastructure, generating millions of dollars in profits while corrupting city officials at every level. Vincent Castellano Jr., now 78 years old and confined to a wheelchair due to advanced Parkinson's disease, sat silently through most of the trial, occasionally conferring with his attorneys, but showing no visible emotion as witness after witness described his organization's role in the firefighters' murders. His son, Michael Castellano, had been killed in a rival gang shooting in 1989, taking many of the operation's secrets with him to the grave. The defense strategy was to argue that too much time had passed for reliable testimony, that many of the alleged perpetrators were already dead, and that the prosecution was pursuing a vendetta against elderly men for crimes that may never have happened in the way the government claimed. Defense attorney Jonathan Hayes argued that the physical evidence was consistent with an accidental explosion caused by gas leaks or equipment malfunction, and that the subsequent tunnel modifications were legitimate safety measures rather than criminal concealment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hayes said in his opening statement, "the prosecution wants you to believe in a vast conspiracy that lasted for decades, involving dozens of people who somehow managed to keep perfect silence about multiple murders and a massive cover-up. The simpler explanation is that 5 brave firefighters died in a tragic accident, and that grief-stricken families have spent 36 years creating elaborate theories to avoid accepting the painful reality that sometimes terrible things happen without anyone being to blame." But the defense arguments crumbled under the weight of physical evidence and testimony that was too detailed and consistent to be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. The explosive residue patterns, the architectural evidence of deliberate concealment, the documentary proof of the smuggling operation, and the testimony of multiple witnesses painted a picture of criminal conspiracy that was impossible to explain as accidental or coincidental. The prosecution's most dramatic moment came when they presented audio recordings that had been discovered in Robert Hartley's personal papers, conversations between city officials discussing the problem created by the firefighters' discovery of the smuggling operation and the need for permanent solutions that would ensure the evidence never came to light. "We can't have 5 Boy Scouts running around talking about what they saw down there," one official could be heard saying on a recording dated October 16, 1972. "This thing is too big to let some firefighters bring it all down. We need to make sure they can't talk to anybody ever." The defense objected to the admissibility of the recordings, arguing they were too old and potentially altered, but federal audio experts testified that their analysis confirmed the recordings were authentic and had not been tampered with. The jury heard city officials casually discussing the murder of 5 public servants as if they were solving a business problem rather than planning multiple homicides. As the prosecution's case progressed, additional witnesses came forward with information they had been too frightened to share for decades. Former city employees testified about being ordered to work on tunnel projects with no documentation, about being told to forget what they had seen, about receiving implied threats if they ever discussed their work with anyone outside the operation. Sarah Mitchell, Thomas's daughter, testified about the impact of the cover-up on the families, describing decades of uncertainty, financial hardship, and emotional trauma that could have been avoided if officials had simply told the truth about what had happened. "They didn't just kill our fathers," she told the jury. "They stole our entire lives, our ability to grieve properly, our faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect us." The defense attempted to portray the family members as motivated by financial gain rather than justice, but their cross-examination only reinforced the impression of people who had suffered tremendously and were seeking accountability rather than profit. Margaret Mitchell's sacrifice became a central theme of the trial, with multiple witnesses testifying about her dedication to finding the truth, even when it cost her family their financial security and emotional well-being. Marcus Washington, James's younger brother who had become a firefighter himself, provided some of the most powerful testimony about the ongoing impact of the crime. "I spent my entire career wondering if the same thing could happen to me," he testified. "Every time I went into an underground emergency, I wondered if I was walking into a trap, if there were people in positions of authority who would sacrifice firefighters to protect their criminal associates." After 6 weeks of testimony, involving more than 80 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of documentary evidence, the prosecution rested their case with closing arguments that emphasized the long-term impact of the crimes on both the immediate victims and the broader community. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez reminded the jury that justice delayed was not justice denied, and that the defendants' advanced age did not absolve them of responsibility for decades-old crimes. "These defendants may be old men now," Martinez said in her closing argument, "but when they committed these crimes, they were young men in positions of power and authority. They made deliberate choices to value profit over human life, to protect criminal enterprises over public safety, and to maintain their secrets through murder and concealment. The passage of time doesn't change the moral weight of those choices or reduce their responsibility for the consequences." The defense's closing arguments emphasized the prosecution's reliance on elderly witnesses with potentially faulty memories, the possibility of coincidence rather than conspiracy, and the fundamental unfairness of prosecuting people for crimes allegedly committed decades earlier. But their arguments seemed weak compared to the overwhelming evidence of deliberate criminal conduct. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdicts were read, with family members embracing and crying as they finally heard official acknowledgement of what they had known for decades. 7 of the 12 defendants received prison sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, though most would likely die in custody due to their advanced age and poor health. 3 others had died during the lengthy trial proceedings, and 2 were found mentally incompetent to stand trial due to dementia and other age-related cognitive impairments. Vincent Castellano, Jr. received the longest sentence, 30 years in federal prison, despite his lawyer's arguments that his Parkinson's disease made incarceration tantamount to a death sentence. Federal Judge Patricia Williams rejected those arguments, saying that Castellano had enjoyed decades of freedom that his victims had been denied, and that the severity of his crimes warranted the maximum penalty regardless of his current health status. The sentences brought closure to some family members, but others struggled with the knowledge that justice had come too late for many of the perpetrators, and that no punishment could restore the decades of suffering caused by the cover-up. Amy Chen expressed mixed feelings about the verdicts, saying she was grateful for the official acknowledgement of the truth, but saddened that Margaret Mitchell and so many other family members had not lived to see justice done. The trials also sparked broader reforms in how the city handled missing persons investigations, cold cases, and infrastructure projects. New oversight mechanisms were created to prevent the kind of coordinated cover-up that had concealed the firefighters' murders, and victims' families were given greater rights to access information and participate in ongoing investigations. The tunnel system where the crimes had been committed was permanently sealed and converted into an underground memorial park, honoring not just the 5 murdered firefighters, but all public servants who had lost their lives in the line of duty. The memorial included detailed accounts of the investigation, the cover-up, and the decades-long struggle for justice, ensuring that future generations would understand the price of corruption and the importance of holding public officials accountable for their actions. Sarah Mitchell, now in her 50s and the unofficial spokesperson for all the families, spoke at the memorial dedication ceremony before a crowd of several thousand people. She talked about the importance of never giving up on the truth, about the power of ordinary people to demand accountability from their government, and about her mother's unwavering faith that justice would eventually prevail. My father and his fellow firefighters died because they stumbled upon corruption and refused to look the other way, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the crowd gathered at the memorial site. My mother spent the rest of her life ensuring that their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten and that the truth would eventually come to light. Today, we honor not just 5 heroes who died doing their duty, but everyone who refuses to let truth stay buried, no matter how powerful the forces trying to conceal it. Amy Chen, now in her mid-30s and a nationally recognized civil rights attorney, had built her career on pursuing cases that others considered unsolvable or too politically sensitive to handle. She kept her father's photograph prominently displayed in her law office, alongside a picture of Margaret Mitchell holding a banner that read, "Never forget the 5." The two women had never met during Margaret's lifetime, but their shared dedication to the same cause had created bonds that transcended time and death. The case of the missing firefighters became a textbook example used in law schools and police academies across the country, demonstrating how persistence, courage, and systematic investigation could overcome even the most determined efforts to suppress truth and avoid accountability. Law enforcement agencies studied the investigation techniques that had finally solved the decades-old murders, and the story inspired other families to renew their own searches for missing loved ones and answers to unsolved crimes. The broader impact of the case extended beyond law enforcement and legal reform to influence how communities throughout the country dealt with official misconduct and institutional cover-ups. The story of the 5 families who refused to accept easy answers became a symbol of citizen activism and the importance of maintaining faith in justice even when institutions fail to provide it. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Thomas Mitchell, David Sullivan, Robert Chen, Michael Torres, and James Washington. We'll see you in the next video. In the end, truth did emerge from the darkness of those forgotten tunnels, but only after 36 years of deliberate concealment, systematic lying, and institutional betrayal. 5 brave men who had dedicated their lives to saving others were finally able to rest in peace. Their families found the closure that had been denied to them for decades, and a community learned that some mysteries are worth pursuing no matter how long it takes or how powerful the forces trying to keep them buried. The price of silence had been paid in full, measured not just in the 5 lives lost in 1972, but in the decades of suffering endured by families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. Justice, though delayed by more than 3 decades, had finally arrived.